August 15, 1942. Houston, Texas. The mirror in the bathroom was cracked. It split Calvin Graham's face right down the middle, separating his left eye from his right. He leaned in close, so close his breath fogged the glass. He was studying the stubble on his chin, or rather, the lack of it. He rubbed his jaw. It was smooth as a peach. 17, he whispered to the reflection. I am 17 years old. The voice that bounced back sounded high. It sounded like a choir boy. It sounded like what he was, a 12-year-old kid who should be worrying about 7th grade math, not the Imperial Japanese Navy. Calvin grabbed his older brother's shaving brush. He didn't have any cream, so he used bar soap, working it into a lather. He smeared it on his face, trying to look like the men in the Gillette ads. He scraped the razor over his smooth skin, hoping the irritation would make him look weathered, rougher, older. From the other room, a crash. The sound of a bottle hitting the wall. Then, the heavy, angry footsteps of his stepfather. Calvin, where the hell are you? Calvin froze. The fear wasn't a sharp spike anymore. It was a dull, constant ache in his stomach. The house wasn't a home. It was a minefield. And the world outside. The world was burning. Every Saturday, Calvin sat in the dark theater and watched the newsreels. He saw the black smoke over Pearl Harbor. He saw the Marines dying on islands with names he couldn't pronounce. He saw the lines of men signing up to fight. They looked like heroes. They looked like they had a purpose. They looked like they belonged somewhere. Calvin rinsed the soap off his face. He put on his brother's fedora. It was too big, so he stuffed newspaper into the band. He put on his brother's jacket. The sleeves came down to his knuckles. He looked in the mirror one last time. He didn't see a child. He saw a soldier. 17, he said again, deeper this time. A lie he had to believe or he would die. The forgery. The Hotel Texas was sweltering. The recruitment office was set up in the lobby, a row of folding tables manned by sweating officers in crisp uniforms. Calvin stood across the street watching. He had a plan. He had practiced it for weeks with his friends. But his friends had backed out. They were scared. They had gone back to playing baseball. Calvin wasn't playing. He patted his pocket. Inside was the notary stamp he had stolen from the hotel's front desk when the clerk wasn't looking. And the letter. I give my permission for my son, Calvin Leon Graham, to enlist in the United States Navy. He is 17 years old. It was signed with his mother's name. He had forged it carefully, tongue sticking out of the corner of his mouth, copying her loop-de-loops. He had stamped it with the stolen seal. It looked official. It looked real. He took a deep breath of the humid Texas air. It smelled of exhaust and dust. Just walk, he told himself. Don't run. Men don't run unless they're charging. He crossed the street. He pushed through the revolving doors. The lobby was loud. Ceiling fans chopped the smoke-filled air. He got in line. The guy in front of him was huge, a farm boy with hands like shovels. The guy behind him was smoking a cigarette, looking bored. Calvin tried to stand tall. He stretched his spine. He was 5 feet 2 inches. He weighed 125 pounds. Next, Calvin stepped up to the table. The petty officer didn't look up. He was scribbling on a form. Name, Calvin Graham, sir. Date of birth, April 3rd, 1925, sir. The petty officer stopped writing. He looked up. He squinted. He saw the fedora. He saw the jacket that swallowed the boy's frame. He saw the face that had never seen a razor. 1925? The officer asked. That makes you 17. Yes, sir. The officer leaned back. He looked amused. You got ID, son? No, sir. Lost it. You got a birth certificate? No, sir. But I got this. Calvin slid the forged letter onto the table. The officer picked it up. He looked at the signature. He looked at the notary stamp. The ink was still fresh. The officer looked at Calvin again. He looked at the line of men behind him. The Navy needed bodies. They needed warm bodies to shovel coal and load guns. They were losing ships faster than they could build them. The officer sighed. He handed the letter back. Go to the medical line. Door on the left. Calvin's heart did a somersault. He had passed the first gate. The dentist. The medical exam was a slaughterhouse of dignity. Men were stripped to their underwear, poked, prodded, and weighed. Calvin stood in his boxers, shivering despite the heat. He tried to puff out his chest. He tried to hide the fact that he hadn't hit puberty yet. The doctor checked his heart. Boom, boom, boom. Fast but strong. Nervous, kid? Excited, sir. Right? Open wide. The dentist. This was the danger zone. Calvin knew his molars hadn't all come in. A dentist could read age like a tree ring. The dentist was an older man with thick glasses. He stuck a mirror into Calvin's mouth. He hummed a tune. He stopped humming. "Hey, Frank!" The dentist called out to another doctor. "Come look at this." Calvin froze. His mouth was clamped open by the mirror. The other doctor came over. "What?" "Look at the 12-year molars," the dentist said. "They ain't even through the gums yet. And the wisdom teeth? Nowhere to be seen." The dentist pulled the mirror out. He looked at Calvin with suspicion. "How old are you, really?" Calvin's mind raced. He could run. He could cry. Or he could lie like his life depended on it. "I'm 17, sir," Calvin said, putting on his toughest accent. I got bad teeth. Runs in the family. My pa lost all his by 20. It's genetic." The dentist looked at him. He looked at the line of 50 naked men waiting behind him. He looked at the clock on the wall. It was almost lunch. "Genetic, huh?" The dentist grunted. "Well, you ain't gonna be chewing steak where you're going anyway." He stamped the paper. Passed. Calvin grabbed his clothes. He felt lightheaded. He had done it. He was in the United States Navy. Boot camp. San Diego. The train ride was a blur of landscape and cigarettes. Calvin smoked for the first time, coughing until his eyes watered, just to fit in. Boot camp was a shock. It wasn't the movies. It was screaming. It was running until you puked. It was marching in the sand until your feet bled. Calvin was the smallest recruit in Company 368. The drill instructors called him Baby Face. They called him Midget. They rode him harder than anyone else. "You think this is funny, Graham?" The DI screamed, his nose inches from Calvin's face. "You think war is a game? You're weak. You're a little girl." "No, sir," Calvin screamed back, tears stinging his eyes. "Drop and give me 50. Calvin dropped. His arms shook. His muscles burned. But he did them. He did them because he couldn't go back to Texas. He couldn't go back to the stepfather and the broken bottles. This hell was better than that hell. At night, in the barracks, the other recruits talked about girls and cars. Calvin listened, pretending he knew what they were talking about. "Hey, Cal," a recruit named Miller whispered from the bunk above. "You ever been with a woman?" Calvin panicked. "Yeah, sure. Lots of them." "What was it like?" "It was soft," Calvin improvised. "And nice." Miller laughed. "You're a virgin, ain't you?" "Shut up, Miller." Calvin pulled the wool blanket over his head. He missed his mom. He missed his dog. But he couldn't show it. He had to be a man. The assignment. 6 weeks later, they stood on the parade deck in their dress whites. They were sailors now. The assignments were read out. Miller. USS Hornet. Smith. USS Enterprise. Graham. Calvin stepped forward. USS South Dakota. A murmur went through the ranks. The South Dakota. Battleship X. The newest, fastest, most heavily armed battleship in the fleet. She was a monster of steel, bristling with 16-inch guns that could hurl a Volkswagen over a mountain. Calvin felt a surge of pride. He wasn't going to a tugboat. He was going to the tip of the spear. Battleship X. The first time Calvin saw the South Dakota in Pearl Harbor, he stopped breathing. She was massive. A floating city of gray steel. She blocked out the sun. Men were scurrying over her decks like ants. He walked up the gangplank, his sea bag heavy on his shoulder. He saluted the flag on the fantail. He saluted the officer of the deck. "Permission to come aboard, sir." The officer returned the salute. He looked down at the tiny sailor. "Welcome aboard,
Son.
Try not to fall overboard. Calvin found his bunk. It was 3 tiers high, cramped, and smelled of diesel and sweat. He was assigned to the gunnery department. He would be a loader on a 40mm anti-aircraft gun. His job was simple when the planes came past the ammo. Don't stop. Don't look up. Just feed the gun. October 1942. The Pacific. The ocean was endless. For weeks they sailed south. The heat grew intense. The equator turned the ship into an oven. Calvin grew up fast. He learned to curse. He learned to gamble. He learned how to sleep standing up. But the silence was the worst part. The ocean was too big, too quiet. Something's coming. An old chief petty officer told him one night on watch. They were leaning on the rail, looking at the phosphorescence in the water. How do you know, Chief? Calvin asked. I can smell it, the chief said. The Japs are out there. They're waiting for us near Guadalcanal. Calvin gripped the rail. Are you scared? The chief looked at the boy. He saw the baby fat still clinging to his cheeks. Everyone's scared, kid. If they say they ain't, they're lying or they're crazy. I'm not scared, Calvin lied. The chief smiled sadly. You will be. October 26, 1942. Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. The alarm didn't sound like a bell. It sounded like a scream. Gong, 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 gong. General quarters. General quarters. All hands man your battle stations. Calvin was in the mess hall eating powdered eggs. He dropped his fork. The ship heeled over hard to port as the captain threw the massive battleship into a turn. This is it, someone screamed. Calvin ran. He scrambled up the ladders, his boots clanging on the metal. He burst out onto the deck into the blinding sunlight. The sky was filled with black dots. Bogies. 12 o'clock high. Calvin reached his gun tub. It was a 40mm Bofors mount on the starboard side. His crew was already there. Get the clips, Graham, the gunner's mate yelled. Calvin grabbed a heavy clip of 4 shells. They weighed almost as much as he did. He slammed them into the hopper. Thump, 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 thump. The gun roared to life. The whole ship began to shake. The South Dakota was opening up. Her 5-inch guns, her 20 MMS, her 40 MMS, everything was firing. The sky turned into a wall of black flak puffs. Calvin didn't look up. He couldn't. He just grabbed ammo. Load, grab, load, grab, load. The noise was physical. Punched him in the chest. Then, a high-pitched whine that cut through the thunder. Dive bomber. Calvin looked up. A Japanese Val dive bomber was screaming down. Straight for them. It looked like a hawk folding its wings. He saw the bomb detach. A black teardrop falling against the blue sky. Brace! The bomb missed the deck but hit the water close aboard. A massive geyser of water washed over the gun tub, soaking Calvin to the bone. Keep firing! The gunner screamed. Don't stop! Calvin wiped the salt water from his eyes. He grabbed another clip. He looked at the horizon. Another wave of planes was coming. Dozens of them, like a swarm of angry wasps. And in the distance, he saw the carrier USS Hornet burning. This wasn't a newsreel anymore. There was no popcorn. There was no music. Calvin Graham, 12 years old, was in the middle of the apocalypse. And he realized, with a terrifying clarity, that the lie was over. He wasn't a man. He was a boy. And he wanted his mother. But the gun was empty. And the gunner was screaming. So the boy vanished. And the soldier went to work. November 14, 1942. 2,300 hours. Iron Bottom Sound. The water around Guadalcanal had a name, Iron Bottom Sound. It was named for the number of ships, American and Japanese, resting on the rusted seabed. The USS South Dakota sliced through the black water. She was running dark. No lights. No cigarettes. Silence on the decks. Calvin Graham stood in his gun tub, staring into the void. The moon was hidden behind heavy tropical clouds. The air was thick, smelling of salt and rotting jungle vegetation drifting from the island. His helmet felt heavy. It slid down over his eyes if he didn't keep his head tilted back. He was tired. They had been at general quarters for hours. Stay sharp, the gunner's mate whispered. They're out there. Who? Calvin asked. The Kirishima, the mate said. A Japanese battleship. And she brought friends. Calvin gripped the cold steel of the 40mm mount. A battleship duel. They were rare. Usually it was planes dropping bombs. But tonight it would be big guns against big guns. Point-blank range in the dark. Ahead of them, the USS Washington moved like a shadow. 2,330 hours. The lights go out. It started with a flash on the horizon. A Japanese searchlight beam cut through the darkness, blindingly white, locking onto the South Dakota. Then the world ended. Crackboom. The Japanese opened fire. The South Dakota's main battery roared back. The 16-inch guns fired, creating a shockwave so powerful it knocked men off their feet. And then disaster. A circuit breaker tripped deep in the engineering bowels of the South Dakota. It was a freak accident, a technical glitch caused by the shock of their own guns. The ship went blind. The radar screens went black. The fire control computers died. The lights flickered and died. The South Dakota, the most advanced ship in the fleet, was now a blind giant stumbling in a dark room filled with assassins. We lost power, someone screamed. The Japanese didn't miss the opportunity. They poured everything they had into the crippled American battleship. The slaughter. Calvin didn't know about the circuit breaker. He only knew that hell had opened up. Shells began to slam into the superstructure. It wasn't the dull thud of bombs. It was the terrifying metallic screech of armor-piercing shells tearing through steel. Clang. Screech. Boom. A 14-inch shell from the Kirishima smashed into the upper works. Shrapnel sprayed the decks like lethal confetti. Incoming. Calvin ducked behind the gun shield. An explosion rocked the starboard side. A shell hit the gun mount next to them. The shockwave threw Calvin against the bulkhead. His ears popped. For a second, there was no sound, just a high-pitched ringing. Then the heat hit him. Flash fire. The paint on the gun tub blistered. The smell of burning hair and cooking meat filled his nose. He stood up, shaking his head. Is everyone okay? He looked at his crew. The loader next to him was gone. Just gone. Vaporized by a direct hit. The gunner's mate was lying on the deck, screaming. His leg was a ruin of blood and bone. Mama! Mama! The mate was screaming. Calvin froze. He was 12. He shouldn't be seeing this. He should be delivering newspapers. Then, something hit him. It felt like a baseball bat swinging full force into his face. Whack! Calvin spun around and fell hard onto the steel grating. He tasted copper. He tried to spit, but his mouth was full of something hard and jagged. He reached up to touch his face. His hand came away wet and sticky. He spit. 2 teeth rattled onto the deck. Blood poured from a gash in his cheek. Shrapnel had torn through his jaw. He tried to scream, but it came out as a gurgle. Get up, a voice in his head said. Get up, Graham. You're a sailor. He forced himself to his knees. The pain was blinding, a white-hot spike driving into his skull. But he looked around. The deck was a slaughterhouse. Men were burning. Men were blown overboard. The South Dakota was taking hit after hit, 42 hits in total. She was being chewed apart. The boy becomes the medic. Calvin saw a sailor trying to crawl away from a fire. The man's uniform was smoking. Calvin forgot the pain. He forgot the fear. He ran to the man. I got you, Calvin mumbled through his broken mouth. I got you. He grabbed the man by the collar and dragged him away from the flames. The man was heavy, dead weight. Calvin was 125 pounds of grit. He dug his boots in and pulled. He got the man to the shelter of a bulkhead. My arm, the man gasped. Oh God, my arm. Calvin looked. The man's arm was pumping bright red arterial blood. Calvin didn't have a medical kit. He didn't have training. He ripped off his own belt. He wrapped the leather strap around the man's arm, above the wound. He pulled it tight, tighter, until the man screamed and the bleeding slowed to a trickle. Stay here, Calvin said. He ran back out into the fire. The Japanese searchlights were still pinning the ship. Shells were still falling. Calvin found another man. This one had a piece of steel through his leg. "Help me!" Calvin grabbed him. He dragged him to the safe spot. He went back out. Again. And again. He was a blur of motion. A tiny, blood-soaked figure moving through the inferno. He was pulling men twice his size. He was extinguishing fires with his bare hands and jackets. He found a pack of cigarettes in a dead man's pocket. He crawled back to the wounded men he had gathered. There were 5 of them now. They were groaning, crying, praying. Calvin lit the cigarettes. His hands were shaking, covered in his own blood and theirs. He put the cigarettes into the mouths of the dying men. "It's okay," Calvin soothed them, patting their shoulders. "The Washington is hitting them. We're gonna be okay." One of the sailors looked up at him. The sailor's eyes were glazing over. Thanks, Doc," the sailor whispered. Calvin touched his own torn face. "I ain't a doc," he tried to say, but his jaw wouldn't work right. 0000 hours. The turn. Suddenly, the shelling stopped. The USS Washington, invisible in the dark, had finally tracked the Kirishima. The Washington unleashed a devastating broadside. The Japanese battleship was hammered into a wreck in minutes. The Japanese fleet turned and fled. Silence returned to Iron Bottom Sound. But it wasn't quiet. It was filled with the moans of the wounded and the crackle of fires. Calvin slumped against the bulkhead. The adrenaline was fading. The pain was returning, 10 times worse than before. He felt cold. So cold. Shock was setting in. He looked at the men he had saved. 2 were dead. 3 were alive, puffing on the cigarettes he had given them. He looked at his uniform. It was stiff with dried blood. He touched his mouth again. His tongue found the holes where his teeth used to be. The dentist back in Texas had been right. He wouldn't be chewing steak for a long time. The morning after, the sun rose over a battered ship. The South Dakota was scarred, scorched, and full of holes, but she was floating. Calvin tried to stand up for roll call. He swayed. An officer walked by. He stopped when he saw Calvin. "Good God, sailor," the officer said. "Look at your face." "I'm fine, sir," Calvin slurred. "You're not fine. Get to sickbay. Now." Calvin walked to sickbay. He walked past the bodies being sewn into canvas bags. The doctor in sickbay took one look at him and shook his head. "Shrapnel through the cheek. Burn marks. How old are you, son?" Calvin looked the doctor in the eye. 17, sir." The doctor didn't believe him. Not this time. But he didn't say anything. He just started stitching. The metal. Weeks later, the South Dakota was back in port for repairs. The crew was assembled on the deck. The captain stood at the podium. Newsreel cameras were rolling. For conspicuous gallantry, the voice boomed over the loudspeaker. Calvin Leon Graham was called forward. He walked stiffly. His face was still swollen. He had scars that would never fade. The captain pinned the Purple Heart on his chest. Then he pinned the Bronze Star. "Gunner's Mate Graham," the citation read, despite severe wounds to his face, continued to man his gun and aid his fellow sailors, dragging them to safety and administering first aid. The flashbulbs popped. Calvin blinked. He was a hero. He was a veteran. He had seen more death in one night than most men see in a lifetime. And he had just turned 13. The newsreels went out to theaters across America. The face of the baby vet was plastered on screens. In a movie theater in Texas, a woman sat in the dark. She was watching the newsreel before the main feature. She saw the ship. She saw the medals. She saw the boy. She gasped. She recognized the walk. She recognized the ears. "Calvin?" she whispered. She stood up and ran out of the theater. She went straight to the police station. She went to the newspapers. "That's my son," she told the reporters. "That's Calvin. He's not 17. He's 12. He's a baby." The secret was out. And the Navy, which loved a hero, hated a scandal even more. The lie that had saved his life was about to destroy it. January 1943. Corpus Christi, Texas. The train ride home wasn't like the one leaving. There were no cigarettes with buddies. There was no pride. There were 2 shore patrol officers flanking him, handcuffs cutting into his thin wrists. The Navy didn't like being embarrassed. And Calvin Graham, the baby vet, was a walking, talking embarrassment. He was marched into the brig at the Naval Air Station in Corpus Christi. It was a concrete box. It smelled of bleach and unwashed bodies. In there, the guard shoved him. Calvin stumbled into the cell. The door clanged shut. He looked around. The other prisoners were deserters, thieves, brawlers. Grown men with hard eyes. They looked at the kid in the dress whites. "What are you in for, diaper rash?" One of them sneered from the top bunk. Calvin sat on the floor. He touched the scar on his cheek. It was still tender. His mouth still ached where his teeth used to be. "I lied," Calvin whispered. "We all lied, kid. What did you really do?" "I fought at Guadalcanal," Calvin said. "I got the Bronze Star." The cell went quiet. The men looked at the Purple Heart ribbon on his chest. Then they looked at his face, the baby face that barely needed shaving. They realized he wasn't lying. For 3 months, the United States Navy kept a 13-year-old war hero in a cage. They treated him not as a sailor, but as a fraudulent enlistee. They stripped him of his dignity. They tried to break him. Every day an officer would come in. "Sign this, Graham. Admit you defrauded the government." "I just wanted to fight," Calvin would say, staring at his boots. "You broke the law. You are a criminal." Criminal. He had pulled burning men out of a fire. He had loaded a gun while Japanese battleships tried to kill him. And now the country he saved was treating him like an enemy. The stripping. The day of his release was the worst day of his life. He was brought before a tribunal. The room was sterile. The officers sat behind a long table. Calvin Leon Graham, the presiding officer, read, "Your enlistment is hereby voided. You are to be discharged immediately." Then came the kicker. "Because your service was fraudulent, you are not entitled to any benefits. You are not a veteran. You are nothing." The officer stood up. He walked around the table. He reached out and ripped the ribbons off Calvin's chest. The Purple Heart, the Bronze Star, the Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal. He threw them on the table. "These belong to a sailor," the officer said. "You are a child." They gave him a cheap suit that didn't fit. They gave him $33 in his pocket. They opened the gate. "Get out." Calvin stood on the sidewalk in Corpus Christi. The sun was hot. Cars drove by. People were laughing, eating ice cream, living their lives. He touched his chest. Felt light. Empty. He was 13 years old. He had no teeth. He had nightmares that woke him up screaming. And he had absolutely nowhere to go. 7th grade hell. Houston, Texas. 1943. The classroom smelled of chalk, dust, and floor wax. "Calvin?" the teacher asked. "Can you spell arithmetic?" Calvin stared at the blackboard. He was sitting at a desk that was too small for him. The kids around him were whispering, giggling, passing notes. He looked at his hands. These hands had packed 40mm shells. These hands had held a man's artery shut while he bled out. These hands had smoked cigarettes in the dark while waiting to die. And now he had to spell arithmetic. "I can't," Calvin said. "You can't spell it?" the teacher asked, annoyed. "I don't care," Calvin snapped. The class gasped. "Principal's office. Now." Calvin walked out. He didn't go to the principal. He walked out the front door of the junior high school. He walked past the playground. He couldn't do it. He couldn't pretend that the biggest problem in the world was homework. He had seen the world end. He had seen the devil. You can't put a shark back in a goldfish bowl. He went home. His stepfather was there. The drinking hadn't stopped. The yelling hadn't stopped. "You're a disgrace," the stepfather slurred. "Kicked out of the Navy. A liar." Calvin didn't argue. He packed a bag. He climbed out the window. He was 14 now. He was done with childhood. The Marine Corps. He worked odd jobs. He welded in a shipyard, lying about his age again. But the itch wouldn't go away. The civilian world felt fake. Felt like a movie set. 15, he did it again. He walked into a recruitment office. This time, the Marine Corps. Name: Calvin Graham. Age: he looked the recruiter in the eye. He looked older now. The scar on his cheek gave him an edge. 17. He was enlisted. Again. He went through boot camp. Again. He excelled. He was a machine. But fate has a cruel sense of humor. On the night before his unit was set to ship out to the Pacific, to go back to the war he craved, Calvin fell. He was walking on a pier, carrying heavy gear. He slipped. He fell 20 feet onto the concrete deck of a tanker below. Crack. His back broke. He woke up in a hospital. He couldn't move his legs. The doctors looked at his file. They saw the name. They saw the history. Graham? A doctor asked. Are you that Graham? The baby vet. The secret was out again. The Marines discharged him. Not for the broken back, but for the lie. They gave him no disability pension. They gave him no medical care for his spine. They kicked him out onto the street, paralyzed and penniless. He was 17 years old. The lost years. The next 30 years were a blur of pain and poverty. Calvin regained the use of his legs, but his back was ruined. He lived in constant agony. He couldn't hold down a heavy labor job. He drove cabs. He sold magazine subscriptions. He married. He divorced. He married again. He suffered from PTSD before anyone knew what it was. He drank to stop the nightmares of the South Dakota. He watched the Vietnam War on TV. He saw veterans coming home and getting treated like dirt. He felt a kinship with them. But what ate at him the most wasn't the pain. It was the injustice. I served, he told his wife, Mary, late one night. I bled. I did my job. Why did they take my name? The government said he didn't exist. According to the records, Calvin Graham never served. His wounds were non-service connected. His medals were void. He was a ghost. 1976. The Fight Back. Calvin was 51 years old. He looked 70. His teeth were dentures. His back was a knot of scar tissue. He decided to fight one last battle. Not against the Japanese, but against Washington, D.C. He started writing letters. He wrote to congressmen. He wrote to senators. He wrote to the Navy Board of Corrections. Most of them ignored him. Rules are rules, they said. You enlisted fraudulently. But then the story caught the wind. A reporter picked it up. The boy who saved the battleship. The public outrage was slow, but it built. It reached the White House. President Jimmy Carter read the file. He saw the absurdity of it. A man who had been a hero at 12 was being punished at 50 for being too eager to serve. 1978. The partial victory. A letter arrived in the mail. Honorable discharge. Calvin held the paper. His hands shook. He was officially a veteran. He had his honor back. But he didn't have his benefits. The government restored his rank, but they refused to pay for his medical bills. They refused to give him back pay. It's a start, Calvin said, pinning the paper to his wall. But he was dying. His heart was failing. The years of stress and physical pain were taking their toll. He spent his final years in a small house in Fort Worth, Texas. He spent his days sitting on the porch, looking at the old photos of the South Dakota. He remembered the smell of the cordite. He remembered the cigarettes in the dark. He remembered the faces of the men he saved. I did good, didn't I? He asked Mary. You did good, Cal, she said. You were the best of them. 1988. The Hollywood moment. TV movie producers came knocking. They made a movie called Too Young the Hero. Ricky Schroeder played Calvin. For a moment, Calvin was famous again. The world remembered him. But the movie didn't pay the bills. And the Navy still refused to give him his disability pension. Calvin watched the movie premiere from his living room. He saw the actor playing him running across the burning deck. He touched the scar on his cheek. It was louder than that, he whispered. Much louder. November 6, 1992. The final bell. Calvin Graham died at home. He was 67 years old. He died without his Purple Heart. The Navy had stripped it in 1943 and never physically returned the medal to him. He died knowing he was right, but feeling like he had lost. 1994. The Vindication. 2 years after he was buried. The Secretary of the Navy, under pressure from the public and the media, finally signed the order. A ceremony was held in Texas. It was small. There were no newsreels this time. An officer handed a small velvet box to Mary Graham. Inside was a Purple Heart. Inside was a bronze star with a Combat V device. And inside was a check. Not for millions, but a check for the disability benefits he should have received for his back injury. The Navy finally admitted he was a sailor. He was a hero, and we were wrong. Epilogue. If you go to the Laurel Land Memorial Park in Fort Worth, Texas, you will find a simple grave. It doesn't say the 12-year-old liar. It reads, Calvin L. Graham, U.S. Navy, World War II. He lies there in the quiet earth, far from the ocean. But his story remains one of the strangest and most poignant of the war. It is the story of a boy who stole a notary stamp to fight for his country. A boy who learned that war is not a movie. And in the end, Calvin Graham proved something important. Courage doesn't check your ID. It doesn't care about your birthday. When the lights go out and the shells start falling, a hero is just the person, man or boy, who doesn't run away. The end.